Hi, this is Tom Cole, the 4th District of Oklahoma, and this is another one of our weekly chats. Congress hasn't been in session, but that doesn't mean a lot of us haven't been at work. Actually, the Appropriations Committee has met all week long in Washington, D.C. I'm actually talking to you from my personal office there right now, and in the last 2.5 weeks, the Appropriations Committee has 12 committees, and obviously they have subcommittees as well. So we've marked up. We've had 24 committee meetings. I've been involved in my share of them, not all of them, obviously. We've marked up all 12 bills that fund the government of the United States, and they've all passed out of committee. Now they've passed largely along party line votes. As a matter of fact, almost exclusively on party line votes, and there's been a lot of conflict, and we'll talk about some of that. But this is actually an important point in the process. I mean, this is the opening position of the Democrats, the majority party in the House. They didn't get a single Republican vote on any of their final passage out of committee on their bills. Republican concerns really could be summed up in three things. Number one, there's not enough money here on defense. The numbers just simply too low in a world where the Russians and the Chinese are as active and actively modernizing their forces. It's a dangerous world. We ought to be spending at a somewhat higher rate. Second, on domestic spending, we're spending way too much. There, we actually increased spending by about 18%. That's on top of all these special infrastructure bills and coronavirus bills and things that you're hearing about. It's just the day-to-day operation of government. The Democratic explosion of spending is just unprecedented in American history. And it's going to lead to, I think, inflation, certainly to longer term, to an extraordinarily difficult national debt to deal with. And a lot of this stuff is not one-time spending. It's built into the process and will be there going forward unless some really tough decisions are made. So we've been drawing lines in the sand and trying to push our Democratic friends in a different way. And we might be able to do that later in the process. But at the beginning, the committee level, they have the votes and they're able to control it. But again, I'm very proud of our Republicans who, again, put out vote after vote. Probably the most stubborn fight that we had this round actually wasn't over spending. It was over the Democratic decision to move the so-called Hyde and Weldon amendments out of the Labor, Health, Human Services, and Education bill. Just to refresh your memory, the Hyde Amendment's been around for 45 years. It prevents the federal government from spending federal tax dollars on abortion, except in very limited cases, rape, incest, and life of the mother. The Weldon Amendment is a conscience protection amendment that's been around about 16 years, and it says no doctor, nurse, healthcare professional can be forced to participate in an abortion if they have a moral objection to doing so. Democrats decided they were going to strip both those things out. We have warned them, if you do that, there will not only be no Republican support in the House for any appropriations bill, but you'll also find that you might not be able to pass it out of the House. You certainly won't be able to pass it in the Senate where 60 votes are required. So we had round one of this fight, so to speak, this week, both at the subcommittee level, but more importantly, at the full committee level. I offered an amendment to restore the Hyde Amendment. Again, I just think it's wrong to spend taxpayer dollars on abortions when so many people have moral objections to that. And frankly, where the two parties have worked together for 45 years on the Hyde Amendment. That was originally passed by a Democratic House and Senate in 1976 and was meant to be a compromise between the two sides, neither side getting everything they wanted. The Weldon Amendment, to me, is just unbelievable that we would ever force anybody, medical professional, to participate in an abortion if they have a moral objection. I think of a devout Catholic that feels very strongly about that particular tenet in their faith, or just anybody that has a moral objection. We should not make them participate simply because they're a healthcare professional. They didn't sign up to do that, and they certainly didn't sign away their conscience rights as Americans when they became medical professionals. So this is the first round of the battle. It's going to continue. I was extraordinarily proud of the Republicans. We have 26 members on the Appropriations Committee. 24 of them spoke on the amendment. That's how passionate they were. I think all of them were pretty good. Some of them were genuinely excellent, and this is an issue that's important to you. I'd actually encourage you to listen to the debate. Couldn't have been prouder of our side. I think it's one of those cases we didn't have the numbers, so we lost the vote, but I think no question we won the argument. And also no question that the Democrats know that if they proceed down this path, they're going to end up with something called a continuing resolution. That means they'll have to settle for last year's spending bill. That's going to be pretty tough for them because that was Donald Trump's last negotiated budget with Congress. Now, Congress should write a new budget every year. That's just the reality of the situation. We need to do that to adjust to changing circumstances. But believe me, if it gets down to last year's budget, with which contains, of course, the Hyde and Weldon amendments, and a budget this year that did not, none of my colleagues would vote for the budget for this year. They're going to fight this out, and I think in the end, there's no question we'll prevail. I think Hyde Amendment and the Weldon amendments will remain intact another year. But it does remind you of how overreaching and ambitious this Democratic majority is, not just in terms of its spending habits, but in terms of a very radical social leftist agenda that you see across the board. So obviously that's been my focus. That's been the focus of the political world in Washington, D.C., but we ought to think a little bit beyond that. There's three events of the last week or two that I wanted to bring to your attention. The first one in our own country, of course, was the highest inflation numbers we've had in over a decade. This is the early sign of how dangerous the explosive spending programs that the Biden administration and Democratic Congress are pushing. You're talking 5.8% on a year-over-year basis. You're talking 0.9% in a single month. Those are unprecedented numbers. The single month number is the highest since 1980. So we're very, very worried that this reckless spending is raising prices, and that's a hidden tax on every American. You see it when you go buy a gallon of gasoline for your car. You see it when you go buy a gallon of milk for your family. You see it in the cost of goods and services, and even though your own wages might be going up, they're unlikely to over time equal what inflation it does if it really gets out of hand. The last time we really had to deal with it, Ronald Reagan was president, and he broke it, but had to go through a very stiff and punishing recession to actually get there. So we're seeing the early signs of that. That's a matter of great, great concern, and we're going to, again, try to deal with it by putting more of a lid on spending in Washington, D.C. The second and third things are actually things that are happening overseas, and to some degree, they remind you how lucky you are to be an American. The first is just 90 miles off our own shore. We see the rioting of the Cuban people who are undergoing enormous hardship, economic downturn, coronavirus, lack of vaccine. At the root of this is a very repressive, dictatorial communist regime that's been in power for over 60 years. And you're seeing people at great risk to themselves coming into the streets, demonstrating, being bullied, being beaten, being harassed, but frankly, people that are just trying to push their country toward a freer and more open system. We have a tremendous Cuban community in the United States of America. I serve with a number of people who either are Cuban refugees themselves or whose families fled Castro's Cuba and came to the United States. They're wonderful, wonderful members of the American community now. But they have a very deep sense of the dangers of communism and socialism because they've seen firsthand in their own country what the consequences are of abandoning liberty or putting a communist economic system in. Whatever our problems are, remember, nobody ever flees to a communist country. They flee from communist countries to places like the United States, and preeminently and primarily the United States. And we're seeing that sad chapter play out again, literally right on our doorstep. The second thing I would point to is the American decision to leave Afghanistan and what's happening in the wakes. We had relatively small force in Afghanistan, less than 5,000, actually less than 3,500, but considerable air power, the use of Bagram Air Force Base, and and our NATO allies who were there because we were there, provided a security blanket for the Afghans. You're seeing now, as we've pulled out, a resurgence of the Taliban. And remember, it was the Taliban that gave shelter to Osama bin Laden and elements of Al Qaeda and ISIS. These are not our friends. They're not going to be the friends of the Afghan people. Now, I understand a lot of Americans, and frankly, on both sides of the political aisle, have been frustrated by the length of our commitment there. It's been a 20-year stay. And to be fair, President Trump wanted to leave Afghanistan, but I think we may have an unfolding disaster on our hands. Former President George W. Bush spoke out about this week, particularly pointing to the plight of Afghan women and children and what it would mean to go back to a really brutal and repressive regime that I honestly view of women as something out of the 15th century. I mean, it's just, they're not to be educated, not to be allowed freedom, not to be allowed the opportunity to pursue. That's a sad thing. And of course, we were in that country a long time. We had a lot of Afghans that helped Americans. We're very concerned. Frankly, people on both sides of the aisle are about have we evacuated so quickly that those people's lives are going to be at risk? What kind of provisions have been made to get them out of there? Because we do know they'll be targeted by the Taliban. So those are things to reflect on. I hope that we don't see Afghanistan turn into something like Vietnam when we pulled out and we had a human debacle. But there are signs that indeed is happening. And, that's the president's call. He has the right to make the decision. As I said, there are certainly people on both sides of the aisle who agree with him. But the military advice he got from the American military was not to do it. Personally, I think it was a mistake to do it with the speed and rapidity and the way in which we did. I think, there's a big difference between having 3,500 people there that are helping the Afghans versus the 100 and some odd thousand that we had at the height of the war. We had drawn down. We hadn't suffered any casualties this year related to combat. Our people are not in combat. The people bearing the brunt of the fighting of the Afghan security forces. And, we wish them well. We hope things go well. We're going to continue to try and supply them and provide them what assistance we can. But, this was a big gamble by the Biden administration. I hope for the people of Afghanistan and for all the sacrifices our own people have made that it works out. But I just flagged that for your attention because it's a very concerning issue. With that, Congress is back in session next week. We'll be working on the floor. You'll begin to see some of these appropriations bills come out. You won't see them all because honestly, I think the Democrats aren't able to pass them all. It's one thing to pass them in committee. It's another thing on the floor. So we'll see what they decide to put out there. I doubt you're going to see the Homeland Security bill or the Defense bill, two bills where they are very divided and Republicans are absolutely united that Democrats and the Biden administration have made the wrong decisions on those. And if you can't get them through the House where you have a small majority, you're certainly not getting them through a 50-50 United States Senate. So we're a long way away from governing, a lot of battles to fight, a long way away from completing the budget cycle, I should say. I don't expect that to get done for a year. But again, very active and very busy week in Washington, D.C., very sobering week around the world and a concerning week. If you're an American wage earner and all of a sudden you see everything that you're buying is going up, that's something to worry about. That's not prosperity. That's not what we were promised. So we'll keep trying to work at it. And again, thanks for taking the time to tune in. I look forward to visiting with you next week.